Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with another book review of another fabulous film composer. It's Stephen Smith's music by Max Steiner, The Epic Life of Hollywood's Most Influential Composer. It's a hot title, and it's true. Now, I recently reviewed Smith's biography of Bernard Herrmann. And, Bernard Herrmann is a more glamorous film composer type name, at least currently, because I think he had more of an impact on later composers than Steiner did. And because Herrmann was just so obnoxious and difficult, and it was so much fun to read about how obnoxious and difficult he was. And speaking of which, oh, look, there's Finster. Hi, dear. Thank you for joining us. And Max Steiner, I always sort of took him for granted, and I think a lot of us did. We know that he was one of the guys who sort of invented film scoring as we know it, through scores like King Kong. And are you going somewhere? Yes, here we go. Get ready, folks. Okay, go. All right, thank you. Yeah, she stomps all over the computer, and God knows what's going to happen. But I mean, scores like King Kong and then Gone with the Wind and other things. He was incredibly prolific. I mean, he wrote hundreds of film scores, and his life was unbelievable. Actually, from a purely biographical point of view, Steiner is much more interesting than Bernard Herrmann was. I mean, Bernard Herrmann just basically ran around alienating everybody in sight, but Steiner got along with everybody. Steiner was friends with everybody, and his life was still a catastrophe. Oh my God. Unbelievable. And Smith tells the story so well. He's an extremely fine writer, and he's used his sources with really an eagle eye for picking out what's important and organizing it properly. It makes a great tale. But Steiner, let me just tell you a little about his background. It's just marvelously told here by Smith. Steiner began life in Vienna. He was Viennese. He came from a Jewish family that converted. So many of them did. Or at least his father did. His mother, I don't know, she was something else. But the bottom line is his dad ran the Viennese pleasure park, the Versailles pleasure park, or whatever it was, in Vienna. And it had restaurants, and it had, amusements, and it had, all this stuff. And he had the license to do that. Steiner was friends with everybody, his father and the kid, with Mahler, with Johann Strauss, with Brahms, with, you name it. They knew him. It was amazing. He had an absolutely extraordinary upbringing in this sort of like playground for adults. But his father was a complete spendthrift. He ran theaters in addition to all this other stuff, and he bankrupted himself a few times. And his mother also went bust because his father was going bust. And they had this very odd relationship. His mother ran all the restaurants and his father ran everything else. And Steiner basically couldn't wait to get out of there. And he wound up in the UK running theaters. And he spent most of his life, he had to take care of his parents, first of all. His father, eventually, he got him out of Austria after the Anschluss and brought him to the West Coast. And he lived with him, and his father was hopeless, and Steiner was as bad at managing money as his father was, and he had several wives, and his last one, who was a harpist, I think her name was Louise, right? Have I gotten this right? Really was a decent soul, but they both were trying to pursue their own careers, and they had a son, and he and Steiner had no idea how to handle him, because he spent all of his time writing film scores. He was working constantly. It's what he did. He did, the music just poured out of him. And his wife wanted to be a singer, and they wound up getting divorced, and their son wound up committing suicide because he was completely neglected. He was screaming for attention, and they had no idea what to do. All Steiner would do was buy him presents. And in the meantime, he was working like a crazy person, both to create his own music, but also to secure composer's rights so that he could make royalties. He wound up at the end of his life a wealthy man, but getting to that point where he finally started to receive royalties for the music that he created and for some of the songs that derive from them. I mean, it was just a huge, huge battle that took decades, during which his fortune rose and fell as he worked for the various studios and worked with everybody who was everybody in Hollywood. I mean, it's just an astonishing story. Musically speaking, Steiner was a master composer. I personally am not as thrilled by his style as I am by, Bernard Herrmann and some of the later guys, Goldsmith or Bernstein or John Williams even. Steiner's style was late German romantic Wagnerian. He did get into more modern things. And of course, he could modify his style, to do, the Treasure of the Sierra Madre. He needed Spanishisms. He could do that. He did Orientalist fabulousness. I mean, you hear some of that in King Kong or She. That's a fabulous film score that I talked about in a separate video. It's a fantasy picture and whatnot. I mean, he had the versatility within his own style. He certainly had the versatility, and he did have a distinctive style. And he was a prime mover behind so much of what happened. All the other composers who came after, and he gave them their, he got them into the business, and people loved him. He was a gracious, charming, decent person, it seems, who just had no idea how to handle his own life. And so that makes for quite the story, because as he's churning out, great film score after great film score, the studios loved him, because he could do things with amazing facility. He had an army of orchestrators who went to work, and he would write them notes. I mean, the idea that somehow it's better to do your own orchestrations. I mean, Bernard Herrmann sort of pushed that because he always did his own orchestrations. It's a bit of a myth. It really is, because you can write a short score and tell people what to do, which he did with extremely detailed notes, and then you review what they do and you change what you want to change, and you get much the same result. It depends on the kind of composer you are and how you operate. So you can't look down on these professional composers who have assistants who help them, create full scores. I always thought that was ridiculous. Prokofiev used to do that. Prokofiev color-coded his sketches and then gave it to a copyist and said, this is how the orchestration's supposed to go. I mean, in some composers, it's more important than with others. That's just the way it is. It's that simple. But Steiner was a marvel as a composer, and this book just captures all of the craziness, the complexity, the idealism. It's all in here. So Stephen Smith has put together a masterful book that really everybody ought to read, because it's a milestone in the history of film music composing. I mean, a historical description of the evolution of film scoring, as well as just a marvelously sympathetic biography of an extraordinary creative genius musically. And I was thrilled to have the opportunity to read this one right after the Bernard Herrmann book. So keep on listening, friends, and reading. Thanks for joining me. Take care.